I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability, as well as its robust interior, are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
Capella University is rethinking higher education. With its game-changing FlexPath learning format, you can earn your degree on your schedule and fit your education seamlessly into your life. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network.
Hey, so this is actually a very special episode because my guest for the day just didn't show up. It didn't even cancel. And I have nothing against that. I have been known to not show up for things at the last minute, and sometimes people are busy, and sometimes people forget things, and sometimes people are rude, but they know I'm a forgiving person. We'll get this guest on eventually because I'm a fan of his. But meanwhile, as Steve Cohen, my producer, who was sitting right next to me, suggested, what did you suggest?
I said, like, how sometimes people talk about how there's a live time and dead time, and we could either make the time dead by saying, bitching about this person or complaining, or we could choose from the author, or choose yourself, or we could choose to say, hey, let's make this the most productive thing we can do and figure out how do we turn that negative into a positive, turn those lemons into lemonade.
Right. So instead of saying, Sherrod, fuck you, Sherrod, you're always welcome on the show. I hope we can reschedule. And you're a friend, and I'm a fan. But you know what I want to talk about? I love talking about cultural events that really teach me about creativity and competence and how much I need to learn to really achieve, to keep on achieving peak performance at what I love to do. And so I love studying everything in art, everything in creativity. I want to talk about what it means to be competent, particularly in the context of the very last concert ever performed by the Beatles. And I don't know how many people know this, but the last concert performed by the Beatles was kind of almost a spur of the moment concert. They were performing for they were in recording sessions for their last album, which was called Let It Be, which had the song Let It Be on it. They were in recording sessions, and just kind of last minute, it was really sort of last day, they said, hey, let's just go to the roof, bring up all of our instruments, and just start performing on the fly without telling anybody. And I'm glad I saved the link for myself because I love this so much. I saved the link for myself and made some notes about this concert 6 years ago, pretty much 6 years ago today. And I just clicked on the link just now, and on YouTube, it says, this video there's a black space, and this video contains content from Apple Corps and UMG, one or more of whom have blocked it on copyright grounds. So I'm glad I had a chance to watch it. I mean, I probably watched it 100 times at least. And then I wrote down what I learned from it, but I just thought it was such a beautiful concert and has some songs that don't appear on any of their main albums. But the first thing that was so interesting to me is that at the time that they did this album was January 30th, 1969 in London. They had been together, I think, about 12 years. They had performed together for not just 1,000 hours, but tens of thousands of hours all over the world at concerts, practicing. I mean, there's a famous story in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers where they would sometimes perform up to 20 hours a day in Germany before the world even knew who the Beatles were. That's how they got their 10,000 hours in, is that they performed, for so long in every single day in Germany. That's how they really got, comfortable with each other, comfortable with their instruments, comfortable with songwriting. So they had performed together for so much. They knew each other so well. Their lives were so intertwined. And yet at this point in January 1969, the band was essentially dead. Like they never performed again in the same room together. They hated each other with a passion. I think at the time, and again, we're doing this podcast on the fly, so feel free to comment or contribute or something on Twitter or whatever. But at the time, Paul McCartney, I believe, was suing the rest of the band over royalties. His Linda McCartney's father was a lawyer, and he was suing the band. George Harrison had at this point, or a few weeks earlier, had quit the band because he was so sick of John Lennon's, trying to dominate the music writing. George Harrison had quit, and he walked out of the recording session saying, "See you at the clubs." And the band actually thought of enlisting Eric Clapton to replace George Harrison. Now, George Harrison came back to perform on Let It Be and then to perform on the Rooftop. But that just tells you where the tensions were. And by the way, George Harrison, incredible songwriter. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, My Sweet Lord, these are just amazingly beautiful songs. So, clearly there were a lot of harsh egos involved. Meanwhile, John Lennon was involved in his own stuff. He was starting to record his own independent music. Plus, the band didn't like Yoko Ono. That's infamously didn't like Yoko Ono. There's even a song in this Rooftop concert about John Lennon's love for Yoko Ono, and kind of you could see in the video, I remember seeing they're all sort of laughing at John Lennon when he starts singing this song.
And that was Don't Let Me Down, right?
Yeah, Don't Let Me Down. Which is an interesting song because it's, and this is why I love them as songwriters. You don't really see songs written this way anymore. Let's just look at all the layers of that phrase, Don't Let Me Down. First off, he's singing it to Yoko Ono, Don't Let Me Down. Like after he's basically destroyed his relationship with the Beatles because he left his wife for Yoko Ono, he's being vulnerable. He's saying to Yoko Ono, please, don't let me down after all I've done. And, what ended up happening, several years later, he left Yoko Ono for a while and had a relationship with someone else and maybe several other people. And he's saying, don't let me, but I think there's additional layers. He's saying, don't let me down to the Beatles. He thought the Beatles had let him down. He thought their managers had let them down. He thought their producers had let them down. He's saying, don't let me down to the world. Like he already was feeling distant from the fan base of the Beatles, that they didn't really understand anymore who he was. And ultimately, sadly, he was shot. The world did let him down, about 12 years later. And so I think it's just such a poignant song, and he has so much pain in it. And again, competent professionals, you see while they're singing on the Rooftop, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, they're playing it seriously. Paul McCartney is singing, alongside John Lennon, and it's a beautiful, beautiful song. Why do you think that song actually? That song was Phil Spector, who was producing the album Let It Be, he dropped it from the album, even though it's so beautiful. It later appeared in compilations of the Beatles, but while they were a band, it never appeared on any of their albums, and it only hit number 35 on the charts. It was released on the B side of Get Back, which was, of course, a beautiful song. Was Get Back written by Ringo Starr, by the way?
I don't.
I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah.
Because Ringo Starr wasn't. People always put down Ringo Starr
Yeah.
like, oh, he was nobody in the Beatles. But I think he wrote.
He wrote a few. I think he wrote. Did he write "You Know It Don't Come Easy"? You know.
Oh no, "Get Back" was written by Paul McCartney. I don't know why. I always thought it was written by Ringo Starr. I used to play that as a kid on the piano, and I thought, oh, this is Ringo Starr's one song. But I'm wrong. I just realized now I'm totally wrong. But anyway, "Don't Let Me Down" was on the B side of "Get Back," and so what's also interesting is they I think also part of creativity. It's not just that they were so competent together that they can make a song. It's just that they constantly pushed the boundaries of creativity. Instead of just doing a recording session when they all hated each other just to get it over with, they basically, in the middle of winter, January 30th in London, they all went up on the roof and started playing. And so you see in the video, it's so beautiful in the video. I wonder how they got all these video shots, but you see everybody suddenly start on the ground and other office buildings starts looking up. Like, are they live? What's going on? Where's that music coming from? And you see men and women leaving their offices and climbing up fire escapes and standing on rooftops to try to get a peek. And it's just this amazing thing that you wouldn't expect, like Jay-Z right now to stand up on top of some building in Midtown and start doing a live concert.
Occasionally they do. Occasionally even like Jimmy Fallon and I think some of the Roots did like something on the subway, or people will do it, just for that kind of shock value. But I think what attracted you when you wrote about this 6 years ago was just kind of the spontaneity of it and them saying, you know what, let's just go up on the roof, let's do something different. And maybe it was a way to release the tension, to get out of a cramped studio and to do it, and just it's 45 degrees over there. I also thought about.
But think about what you just said, though. Yeah. It's almost kind of by pushing the boundaries on their creativity by doing this rooftop concert, which they didn't even know if they could pull off. They had to drag all their equipment there. It was freezing cold. It was illegal, which I'll talk about in a second. And but maybe to diffuse that tension, and that they really did hate each other. There was like sheer hatred. Like, they hated Paul McCartney for suing them. They hated, when I say they, I mean everybody but the guy I mentioned. They hated John Lennon for going with Yoko Ono and doing his own songwriting and trashing their songwriting. They hated George Harrison for just quitting. George Harrison hated them for always acting like they were the songwriters and not him. Yeah. I don't think Ringo Starr hated anyone. He was just kind of...
He's probably happy to have been there and happy that he wasn't Pete Best and he was part of it. And it's funny, when we decided to just do this podcast spontaneously, we're not up on a roof and it's not 45 degrees, but I've been recently watching the Ron Howard documentary on the Beatles, and that focused more in the beginning. And in just 5 years, you saw them come up from Liverpool, and they were like brothers, and Ringo Starr said he didn't have any brothers, so these were all like brothers, and they alluded to them working in Hamburg at strip clubs and playing all these hours and just getting real in one room without a bathroom, and how they became so close. And maybe it's inevitable. We've seen enough behind the music, about like how these, just the arc of a band where like you get really close and then you kind of resent each other.
Yeah, like very few bands survive for more than like 4 or 5 years, I would say. Like all of my favorite, let's say older bands, don't survive that long. Like, how long did Led Zeppelin survive? Like, their peaks were just like maybe 5 years, and then Robert Plant was off on his own, Jimmy Page was off on his own. Now the Rolling Stones, they're still going strong, and they've been around since 1961. But even the Rolling Stones, they kind of hate each other. Keith Richards has trashed Mick Jagger in his book, and Charlie Watts was always kind of distant. And
well, I just feel like it's kind of like when you see Richard Ben Cramer, what it takes, like what kind of ego does it take to run for president? What kind of ego does it take to kind of get up there and be a band and to think you could accomplish all this and to
that's an interesting sorry to keep interrupting, Steve. I've been interrupted around the podcast.
Obviously.
But that's an interesting thing too, and we've seen this on the podcast. Like, who was it who said it? I think it was Paul Reiser who said it, that when you're in the beginning of when you're at the very beginning of an arc that's going to be great, like the Beatles were obviously from 1957 to 1961 when they were on their first arc, you're almost protected, like in the womb, from knowing that you're not great yet. And because if they had just started playing and said, you know what, we suck, they would have just stopped.
Right,
But
right.
instead, they didn't know. They probably already thought they were great, at least good enough to perform in Hamburg and go on
Right.
the road and team up. They probably barely learned. I mean, it's like the Rolling Stones. When the Rolling Stones started, Mick Jagger didn't know how to do anything. He just loved the
Right.
blues mixed with rock. And there's another point there, which is none of these people, whenever you hear anyone who's great, like whether it's the Beatles or Jay-Z we just
Sure.
mentioned, or the Rolling Stones, or, pick your favorite athlete, it's never by themselves. They all grow up as what I'll call a scene. So when a great story is when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, I guess it was Brian Epstein told them, you guys need to start writing your own music instead of doing covers. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were all day trying to figure out a song to write, and they just couldn't do it. So they took a walk. Who did they run into? But John Lennon and Paul McCartney,
Wow.
who they all knew each other since they were teenagers because they all were hanging out at the same skiff clubs in London when nobody was anybody then. And they said to John Lennon and Paul McCartney, hey, we're having a real hard time coming with our first song. So John Lennon and Paul McCartney went upstairs with them and wrote the Rolling Stones' first original song with, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. So that's another great example. Like, you can't be the best in the world simply by yourself. You grow up as find your teammates, find your Justice League of America.
Well, speaking of which, like in that same Ron Howard documentary, and I was very intrigued with it. Obviously, Ron Howard always, brilliant guy, and he was very successful. And even now, he's like profiling. It's not meant to be a commercial for Ron Howard, but if you appreciate it, Ron, please come.
And by the way, we've had Brian Grazer on the podcast. That was a great one where he describes how he meets Ron Howard.
Yeah, and we also loved your book, Curious Mind, and we're waiting to see your book called Eye Contact, which, again, we'll leave the light on for you like Tom Bodett. But he was very intrigued by the Beatles in the same way that he was intrigued by like the astronauts, because they were these guys up in a shuttle and they were the whole world and them. I think there were so many things that were fascinating about it. But in that, McCartney and Lennon wrote so many songs together, and they found their kindred spirit. They found somebody who shared his passion for it. And Paul McCartney talked about how when they were 15 or 16, he'd always go to parties and he would say, hey, I'm a songwriter. And people were like, oh, what'd you think of the football game? And then he was like, John Lennon, he met a kindred spirit who was like, I love writing songs too. And he had somebody who could kind of, challenge him and really help him.
And it's interesting because no one would ever say, I don't know anyone who ever says they were the best guitar players.
Sure.
I don't know anyone who says Ringo Starr is the best drummer ever.
Well, we saw Quincy Jones recently gave an infamous interview where he said they were terrible musicians and how Ringo Starr was horrible and they would replace him with people. But obviously, if you ask the Beatles when they were at the Cavern Club in the 60s and they were doing their thing, Paul McCartney talked about how he had goosebumps when Ringo Starr came in and what that transformed them. And that was kind of the missing link. So, there's always an alchemy with these kind of groups and these people. And
but it's important, again, to find your scene. Like, people think of Andy Warhol as this very singular, unique artist, but at the time he was competing with Roy Lichtenstein, other artists who were trying to kind of get the pop art, king title. He was competing against the last generation of, Jasper Johns and all these artists, and he had to find his unique thing, but he was still growing up in the scene. You can't remove yourself from the scene ever. And you see this in stand-up comedy, like, who was performing at the Comedy Store in the 70s? Robin Williams, Jay Leno, David Letterman, and probably most of the comedians who went on to great, great heights. It was their scene. They bring each other together. Even they're competitive, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones obviously are very competitive. They also grow up together.
I enjoyed the Steven Spielberg documentary because they talked about him in the 70s, and it was him, Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, and how...
And George Lucas saved Spielberg, right?
Yes,
like Spielberg was coming off some failures.
The movie 1941, which he tried doing a comedy with John Belushi, and it didn't work, and he was kind of in director's jail, and Lucas invited him on to Indiana Jones. And
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny too, like, I always think there's always elements of society that don't really appreciate when something amazing is happening around them. Like, so the Beatles are coming on to the rooftop for this last concert ever, and it's maybe their most beautiful concert, because by then they had so much experience and there's all these new songs. And one guy who was, everybody was wandering into the streets trying to listen, climbing up on rooftops, but one guy said, it's a bit of an imposition to absolutely disrupt all of the business in this area. And I always wonder, where is that guy today? Like, what is that guy's name and what's he doing right now? Is he still alive? Like,
Yeah.
He's famous for basically trashing the best concert ever. And who is he? And the Beatles are the Beatles.
Sure, for sure. I mean, it's probably the version of the Troll right now, or
Someone always has,
Yes.
and then someone called the police too. Like the
Wow.
police. So while they were singing "Get Back," the police started gathering on the roof. And let me see if I can find.
the police wanted them to get back.
Basically, so McCartney says he riffs. He just makes it up in the middle of the song. In "Get Back," you've been playing on the roofs again, and you know your mama doesn't like it. She's gonna have you arrested. And meanwhile, the police are they're waiting for their moment. And I don't know. I just think it's interesting. Like, a creator can never rest. Like, no matter what, they're always trying to push some envelope, no matter what's happening in their lives.
Sure. And well, I was going to say a few things. I mean, one, you have liked to remark when you asked Ice-T if he kind of sat back. I'll let you say it, but what did you learn from Ice-T about like relevance and?
Yeah, so I remember I was on Ice-T's podcast a few years ago, and before we started, we were just hanging out, and I asked him, if you stopped performing, stopped appearing on TV, stopped going on tour, how long would it take before people would stop talking about you? And his answer surprised me. He said 6 months, which I thought was like, oh my gosh, this is Ice-T. He's been one of my hip hop heroes for 20 years, for 30 years. And he thinks I remember him on the movie Breakin' in 1983 or 82. That's where his first appearance was. And I watched that movie over and over. If he thinks just 6 months, what does it mean for the rest of creatives? But it also goes to show you too that we now live in such a fragmented, but also much more creative world. There's so many different forums for creativity that A, I think you can be forgotten pretty quickly, but B, if you do something good, it doesn't matter how long you've been out of the limelight, people will know and pick it up. Like the Beatles have had many bad, horrible songs. I just can't tell you the names of any of them, but all they had to do was do another good song, and then boom, they're back to number one.
Sure. And, we just mentioned George Lucas. I mean, some people didn't like the prequels to Star Wars, or any person who like comes out with a lot of movies. You do remember the hits, and maybe that's obviously encouragement to just keep on going. And there's a kind of like combination of factors that lead to success or critical acclaim. And, so I just think you have to just keep creating, like you said.
You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players, and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Blume, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. Oracle.com/advance.
It's an interesting balance between being prolific, where, basically the whole quantity versus quality argument. I think quality is obviously the things people remember, but I think quantity is important because out of that you get practice, you get experience, and you have the opportunity for 1 out of 10 songs, books, articles, whatever it is you do to be super high quality. And it's a comfort knowing that people won't remember the 9 out of 10 that might be horrible, but they will remember the quality. I always go back and forth on this because too much quantity could ruin your opportunity to just sit back and take a breather. So I wrestle with this all the time. I mean, I went through a phase of about 6 or 7 years where I was writing, actually even longer than that, more like 16 years when you include my earlier finance writing. But let's say 6 years where I was writing every day. I mean, I have in my archives something like 2,500 articles. And, it's, but I do think it's important sometimes to take a breather. I don't know.
Well, it also, I think people kind of like discipline themselves to work every day and to do things every day. And I imagine what I think intrigued you about this last concert, that you were fixated on it because you could relate to certain things about it. But I think obviously all these great writers or composers, they don't always enjoy it, but it's easier when you enjoy it. And maybe, you're not even realizing it. It's a habit like that you really enjoy doing it every day. That's why you're doing it. You're doing it for the sake of doing it. You're doing art for the art's sake rather than any other reasons, right? I mean, isn't that what motivates most of these people to do it? I mean,
but then the question is, so they all went off to do their own individual things, but I would say still probably their best work ever was when they were with the Beatles. And so like take Paul McCartney. I mean, maybe he would argue, and I wouldn't argue with Paul McCartney on anything musical, but arguably many people would probably think his best work was with the Beatles. How do you think someone like that is still creative, but deals with the fact that his best work was 40 or 50 years ago?
Well, I think like a couple of things. I know like one of our favorites, Judy Blume, I think like whenever she sees people, they always talk about her old books, and then
from the 70s.
Yeah, but then people are like, what are you going to write? Some people are always like, what's your next book? And so, I think that's I think we all have to live in the present and hope that you're gonna, get better and just keep producing quality work. And, we can name a ton of people who produced work that may not be as impactful as the other stuff, but it's still really excellent, and they enjoy doing it. That's why they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, Bob Dylan writes in his memoir Chronicles that he was doing an album in the late 80s. Now, he hadn't done any successful work since the 60s, but he did this album in the late 80s that he knew in advance was going to be horrible. Like, just people were not interested in that music. He even said he was interested in hip hop and other kinds of music, but he was still trying to do stuff that was creative to how he wanted to pursue creativity. And he ended up producing a failed album, but it was still what was moving his own personal creativity forward without caring necessarily whether it was going to be a hit or not.
Well, we had Don McLean who created,
American Pie.
And that, that's one of the most successful songs of all time, and he's still known for it, and he still at close to 70 or around 70 is creating new things. And I also, and it's something you've talked about with Ryan Holiday, how even after posthumously, some things are appreciated more. So I don't think creative people are thinking just right in the moment as much. And look at anybody. You can mention, Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Like, she'll never be known for something more than Seinfeld or Saturday Night Live. And then Veep is a very good show. Or Ted Danson will be known for Cheers. And then Becker comes, and it's still a credible show. And people, if you've never seen those other ones, you would like whatever he was working on, or Bored to Death, or other things. So I feel like we all have to do the best we can at that time, regardless if, our best days may be behind us, or, the zenith of creativity, and, you have to do the most with what you have at that time. What other choice do you have?
Yeah, and also I think, personal improvement happens no matter what. So if you feel people get satisfaction not necessarily from millions of people liking their work, but if they feel like they themselves are personally improving, and I think that's what a lot of artists and creatives and musicians and writers and so on, have to keep in mind is that that's a big source of pleasure is sensing your own improvement, whether or not it's hitting the entire world. Because we live in such a granular world now where, we were talking the other day, all of us in here, including Jay, the audio engineer, about computer. I didn't know this. There are apparently teams for computer games, video games. Like this shows how out of date I am, and
or how Jay is video game athletes.
There's a $24 million prize pool in the latest video game tournament. And this is a bigger business than tennis and golf combined. Like I'm incredibly surprised, but so it must have 100 million fans at least. And yet I'm not one of them. I think at the time, everybody in the world was a fan of the Beatles. Everybody in the world was a fan of, whoever was the top bands or artists or writers then. And now it's so granular. Like, okay, I've got my 5 people I like on YouTube, my 5 podcasts I like, my 5 blogs I like, my 5 writers I like, and you'll have yours set. But there's so many more outlets to be creative. Is there anything else you want to add?
I wanted to say, among other things, I was going to probably bring up 2 things. One, I always liked how Eddie Murphy really admired Paul McCartney because he said, who were bigger than the Beatles ever? Like, who had more fame, more opportunity for decadence? And, and if you look at Paul McCartney now, even, he seems very sane, very normal, and whatever normal is. I guess that it's kind of like that line, the definition of normal, someone you don't know very well. But he could have been like Elvis. Like, he could have, and dying at 42 and shooting television sets and, really get caught up in excess. So, and I think somebody like Eddie Murphy, who seems to, we talked about this with Tony Rock, seems to have kind of been not afraid of not being able to duplicate his earlier, success. He didn't get up at the Saturday Night Live stuff. He didn't host the Oscars. And, and it's something where just going out there and doing it is pretty amazing. And, that was one thing I always found. I'm wondering what you think about that. Just the ability to achieve all that earthly kind of success and yet remain kind of like Rudyard Kipling,
Yeah, well, I think, there's a saying about wealth, which is that wealth doesn't, having a lot of money suddenly doesn't change you. It just brings out what was already inside of you and magnifies it. So somebody who was meant to shoot television sets and go crazy, that probably was already inside of them, and just sheer wealth and excess allowed him to do that. And Paul McCartney probably deep down was a very, put together person. John Lennon had his own things inside of him. George Harrison had a more spiritual side. So, his original songs like My Sweet Lord are very beautiful and almost spiritual. Ringo Starr was more low key. So even with massive wealth, he's remained more or less low key. But I think it's interesting, just the focus on competence, the focus on always stretching the boundaries of creativity, always trying to improve, and and I think they didn't let not letting personal tensions get in the way of your creativity, because ultimately people remember the rooftop concert for the music, not for most people don't even know kind of the nuances of how much they hated each other at this point. And I just want to close this one. First off, I want to say, if you like this kind of podcast where we sort of analyze something and how it's affected us and our analysis of this, let me know on Twitter. I'm at J Altucher, and tweet about this or tweet anything that I might be missing, or if you disagree with anything. The other thing is, I think we're always stretching our creativity, trying to find different formats for this podcast. We're starting a YouTube channel about the podcast, kind of a post-game analysis, and other YouTube channels. So we're always looking at different ways of doing things. But I want to end with the most important thing I think the Beatles always had, which is the so-called beginner's mind. The idea that the best way to always the person on the steepest part of the learning curve is the beginner. And so if you can keep beginner's mind always, you'll always be on the steep, no matter where you are on the real learning curve, you'll always feel like it's super steep, and you'll find the places where it could be super steep for you and improve the best. And I think at the very end of this, at the end of this concert, The police are all surrounding them. They have to shut it down. It's freezing cold. They've been playing for a half hour. By the way, you can't even find the YouTube video now, so maybe there's some way that it can come out. Is the rooftop concert on the Ron Howard documentary?
I don't think it was. I mean, I think I don't remember it being in there.
You can
know?
see clips of it. Like if you search
Yeah.
"Don't Let Me Down," you can see clips.
They had the Candlestick concert, in there. Yeah.
But so they're about to lay their instruments down for the last time in their lives together, and John Lennon, the last line the Beatles ever say to an audience, John Lennon says, "On behalf of the group and ourselves, I hope we pass the audition."
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.